Good morning. This is the first in a two-part lecture on tropical rainforest dynamics, and in particular looking at sub-canopy survival of plants in tropical rainforests. In this lecture I'll take a look at the sub-canopy environment and strategies of plants to survive in the sub-canopy environment. And in the next lecture I'll take a look at gaps. The gap environment, how often gaps form, and strategies plants use to take advantages of gaps. But in this lecture I'm going to take a look at how plants survive in sub-canopy microclimates of tropical forests. But first, before I go into the sub-canopy, let's take a look at the macroclimates of tropical rainforests. In other words, what is the overall climate at the top of the canopy of a tropical rainforest? So what is it? What is the climate before it is modified by the trees of a tropical rainforest? First of all, sunlight. Sunlight is around 2,000 to 2,500 micromoles per meter squared per second above the canopy. So that's the amount of photosynthetically active radiation impacting on the canopy around midday. Now this is very high. It's the highest in the world. When you get up into temperate regions, you're talking about a PAR of around 1500 micromoles per meter squared per second. So it's a much lower amount, and that's because it's got more atmosphere to go through, and the same amount of light is spread over a wider area up in those temperate regions. So sunlight is very high when it impacts on the top of the canopy. Temperature at the top of the canopy is between the range of 25 degrees Celsius to 33 degrees Celsius maximum, average maximum. It drops down to about 18 degrees Celsius at night on average. Humidity at the top of the canopy varies from about 95 to 100% at night, down to about 65% regularly during the day. So it's quite a wide variation in humidity. So those three main climactic or abiotic characteristics are all very high, and in the case of humidity, very low at the top of the canopy. So when a tree has its leaves up in the top of the canopy, it takes advantage of those very high light levels, but it has to deal with the high temperatures and the low humidities at the same time. Now as you all saw in previous lectures, the sub-canopy microclimates of tropical rainforests are very different. And the main reason for that is the overall structure of the tropical rainforest is a closed canopy with many different layers, and I think this picture really sums it up. You've got lots of trees all growing very close together, and in the sub-canopy and all the way up to the canopy, all the different branches and leaves and so on are overlapping. So there's very little light getting through, and in fact when you look at the light, sunlight is severely attenuated from the top of the canopy to the forest floor. So at about 100% of light at the top of the canopy, down to less than 1% in the forest floor. And this is particularly the case for photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR, because it's that light which is preferentially filtered out by the trees, by the leaves of these plants as you move down through the canopy. The leaf area index is usually greater than about 8. So leaf area index, as you remember, is the number of layers of leaves above a typical point on the forest floor. So in this case, for every square meter on the forest floor, there is 8 square meters above it, and that's quite a lot. So all that light has to get through those 8 layers before it reaches the forest floor. The quality of light is very different as well, known as the red-far red ratio. This basically indicates that the photosynthetically active radiation is preferentially filtered out. So the red light is what the plants really take up. Far red is more of a reference level, so that of light. So the red light is preferentially filtered out as it is used in photosynthesis to excite the photosynthetic machinery. And this red-far red ratio has been shown to be important when it comes to some plant species, seeds which are in the understory. They won't germinate unless they have a high red-far red ratio, and this is thought to be a mechanism to prevent these plants germinating in a understory environment and thus wasting their time because there's not enough light for them to grow. Changes in the red-far red ratio have also been shown to be the trigger to increase growth in understory seedlings. When understory seedlings detect a change in red-far red ratio, suddenly they're getting more energy from their light, more photosynthetically active radiation. They are quite often stimulated to grow. So it's a trigger, so it allows the plants to take advantage of the light which comes through when there is some sort of gap in the canopy. Temperature is also lower. It shows a declining gradient from the top of the canopy to the forest floor of about 24 to 27 degrees Celsius. So from 27 at the top of the canopy down to about 24 at the bottom of the canopy. Temperature is also less variable the further you go down in the canopy. So the canopy actually buffers the canopy will buffer the temperature variations through the night. Right, the relative humidity is much higher in the sub-canopy and varies from, I got 95% there, but usually it's about 100%, between 87 and 100%. So not much variation in the relative humidity below the canopy surface, and that's partly due to the fact that there's very little air movement below the canopy because all those layers of leaves act as a blanket and basically prevent wind penetrating into the bottom of the canopy. So the relative humidity stays much higher and less variable as all the water evaporated and transpired into the sub-canopy remains in the understory, keeping the humidity high. So these factors of light, humidity, temperature, and air movement are all factors which plants have to deal with. The very low light levels are a very limiting or negative factor in the forest floor that plants need to deal with. The very high humidity is a positive factor which the plants can use to overcome light, as we will see. And the lower temperature is also a positive which the plants can help to use them overcome the lower light levels. Now, in these understory regions, it's not just even light, it's not just even shade across the whole of the forest floor. No, it's not as simple as that. There are what is known as flecks of light or sunflecks. So the canopy is never completely uniform. The canopy is broken up, and there are small, what are known as micro gaps in the intact canopy. Also, light will reflect and deflect off leaves of the trees and also off the trunks of trees to give more diffuse light into the forest floor. But the small breaks in the canopy, which you can see in this fisheye hemispherical lens photograph, you can see there's a fairly sizable micro gap there, and there's a few other patches of gaps and so on. And what all of these small breaks in the canopy do is give a dappled effect to the light on the forest floor, and you can see patches of light. Okay, now these patches of light obviously don't stay in the same spot because they are dependent on the attitude of the sun relative to these gaps in the canopy. So as the day goes on, these gaps will move across the forest floor. So for instance, this seedling here will get sunlight at a particular time of day as the sun moves across the sky. So for instance, in this hemispherical photo, the sun may move across the sky in this sort of manner. So directly above the canopy, directly above where this photo was taken, we'll see the sun come through here. It rises in the morning in the east, travels across the sky, sets in the west. When it's around midday, there will be light coming through these micro gaps here, and some more in the morning and very little in the evening. The sun will not cross over this bigger gap for this point above the this point on the forest floor. So the gaps, the sunflecks that it'll get will be in the morning, at midday, and then nothing in the afternoon because it seems to be all shaded. Okay, so sunflecks will move across the forest floor. Seedlings don't move, so they will only receive sunlight at a higher intensity than they normally get in the understory at a particular time. And also these sunflecks will vary according to the season, because as you know, that track of the sun across the sky is not going to be the same throughout the year. There will be variation. There may be it may follow a track further to the south in the winter and a track further to the north in the summer. So these sunflecks on the forest floor are going to move around by the day, and they're also going to move around according to the season. So this seedling here is not guaranteed to get sunflecks during all parts of the day, nor in all parts of the year. So while it gets sunflecks during the day and during a season of the year, it needs to take advantage of them. And sunflecks are very important. They're thought to be of enormous importance to the carbon balance of understory plants. If a seedling is fortunate enough to germinate in an area where there are large amounts of sunflecks, then they will get a very high proportion of light. Sunflecks are quite often about 10 to 20% of canopy light, and may actually be even higher. So if we look at this graph here, okay, in this case the sunflecks are going up to about 80 to 90% of the normal amount of canopied light, light which occurs at top of the canopy. So we've got photon irradiance, which is also PAR, photosynthetically active radiation. See, we've got about 2,000, probably go up to about 2,500, which would be up here somewhere. But the amount of PAR at normal times during the day, so this is time of day down the bottom here, would be fairly low. You're looking at less than 1%, and that's going to be pretty low for the seedling. And then suddenly it encounters a sunfleck, and the amount of photosynthetically active radiation shoots up, spikes, okay, up to maybe 40 to 50% of what it normally is above the canopy. And then around 1 o'clock you get a very large gap, so you get that amount of light for a good 20 to 30 minutes during the day. And it's thought that given the practically zero PAR outside of these sunfleck times, these sunflecks would represent 80 to 90% of the amount of photosynthetically active radiation that this seedling would encounter. So you can immediately see that sunflecks are incredibly important to seedlings. But the main problem with sunflecks is that, as I said before, they move. So not only are they moving during the day, as you can see here, okay, but they're also moving during the time of year. So this point on the forest floor, which receives 2 large sunflecks during the course of the day, that's only at this particular time of year. And at another time of year, this pattern would be completely different. So the end result is that plants growing on the forest floor, which would really benefit from sunflecks, are not going to be able to predict when and where those sunflecks are going to be. So they cannot form physiological and morphological adaptations to maximize the amount of sunflecks they get. So they just have to take a chance that some of the seedlings dispersed will get sunflecks, and accept the fact that a lot of them are not going to. So there are strategies for sub-canopy survival. Tree seedlings need to be able to survive this sub-canopy environment until they get their leaves up into the canopy. So here we have a mora forest. There's a chap there looking at a big mora tree, adult mora tree, and you can see all the mora seedlings in the foreground here. So these are all mora tree seedlings. So this big tree has spread its seeds on the forest floor, and all of these mora seedlings have grown up as a result. So these seedlings need to survive a low light sub-canopy environment until they grow tall enough, like Mummy there, and get their leaves up into the canopy. Some plants have gone the other way, like this mountain rose tree in Trinidad. Mountain rose, or Brownia capitella, I believe. Brownia coccinea subspecies capitella. It's called mountain rose or Cooper hoop in Trinidad. You may recognize the characteristic red flowers that it puts out. This tree has adapted itself to survive in the very low light conditions in a tropical rainforest. So it doesn't attempt to get itself up into the canopy of the forest. Instead, it has resigned itself that it's never going to get tall enough, and it is what is known as an understory tree. So it always remains small in the sub-canopy, but it is able to reproduce even in the very low light environments underneath the canopy. And there are a number of these understory trees. Certainly not the same number as the canopy trees, but certainly a fair few. So we have the seedlings needing to survive, and we've also got sub-canopy trees which survive in the sub-canopy all the time. So the sub-canopy is a very low resource, high competition environment, particularly when it comes to light, but also for nutrients and water. So these plants need to be able to survive in this very highly competitive environment. They need to be K-selected. And there are a number of different strategies which these plants can deal with, but one of the fundamental things which they need to do is to make sure that their carbon balance is right. Okay? What carbon balance means is that photosynthesis must equal or be greater than respiration. When it comes to carbon, each plant in the understory and in the canopy as well has or carries out photosynthesis to capture carbon, make carbohydrates, and it also uses carbohydrates in respiration. So when those two metabolic processes are balanced, then photosynthesis equals respiration, and no biomass is lost, but no biomass is gained. So if we represent the net CO2 uptake, or the net amount of carbon effectively taken up by the plant during photosynthesis, and we plot that against the amount of light which the plant may experience, a plant will typically be below zero. In other words, they are respiring more than they are photosynthesizing, so they're actually losing carbon dioxide rather than taking it up at very, very low light levels. And at a certain point, respiration balances photosynthesis, and so the net CO2 uptake is zero, and then above those light levels there is enough light for more photosynthesis, and so photosynthesis is positive above respiration, and the amount of CO2 taken up increases. And this means that those carbohydrates can be used for building bodies, building cellulose and lignin, and so building trunks of trees and leaves and so on. Okay, and those that rate of photosynthesis, or the amount of carbon uptake, will increase in a curve until the photosynthetic machinery is basically saturated at the light saturation point, and the leaf, or each unit of photosynthetic area, cannot fix any more CO2 for any more increases in light. The understory plants will have a relatively flat curve like this. The curve won't go very high, okay, but it will have a fairly shallow angle of increase. So that means the light compensation point will be, is it steep? Yeah, it's a steep angle of increase. So the light compensation point will be much lower than, say, a plant which is more adapted to open sun conditions, where the light compensation point may be much higher. So that what that means, a plant which is adapted to growing in the understory will be able to balance photosynthesis and respiration at a lower light level than a plant which is more adapted to open sun conditions. So the carbon compensation point is at a lower level of irradiance compared to a plant which needs more light to grow. So carbon compensation point is a good way of assessing whether a plant would be able to survive in the understory. Similarly, this carbon compensation point, usually if it is lower, usually indicates that the maximum photosynthetic rate, or the point at which the photosynthetic machinery of the plant is saturated, usually occurs at a much lower point. So this shade-adapted plant would not be able to take advantage of high light levels as a plant which is more adapted to higher light levels would be able to. So, what are some of the morphological and physiological adaptations which allow a plant to have a lower carbon compensation point? Well, the first morphological adaptation is to have a larger photosynthetic area, much bigger root compared to the shoots, and the leaves need to be large and thin. Having a large photosynthetic area means that you have got more of your body being productive and bringing in carbon, rather than concentrating on the parts of the plant which don't photosynthesize, like the roots, for instance. So roots are non-photosynthetic, so they just respire, and they are a drain on your carbon balance. Leaves, on the other hand, photosynthesize, so they are a help to your carbon balance. So if you have a greater photosynthetic area or leaf area compared to your biomass, then you will have a much better chance at having a high photosynthetic rate at much lower light levels. So this larger photosynthetic area per biomass is known as the leaf area ratio, and it denotes that a plant has if you have a high leaf area ratio, you would have a larger photosynthetic area to scavenge any low levels of light which are available in that sub-canopy environment. So larger photosynthetic area means that a plant is better adapted and will have a lower carbon compensation point in the understory. So leaf area must be large enough to cover root respiration costs. There will be a low root-shoot ratio, so a much higher amount of the biomass directed into the shoot. A big seedling is most competitive. So a seedling which grows relatively tall and has a large photosynthetic area is one which is most likely to survive. But that means that the plant will need to have a fairly large seed. If a seedling is going to be given a very large body or a large photosynthetic area by the adult via the seed, then that seed needs to be very large. So it's the seeds of plants, K-selected plants, which have seedlings which can survive in the understory, those seeds need to be very large. So the seeds are big and the seedlings are big. So a good example of that in Trinidad forests is Mora excelsa, the large tree which you would buy for coals. Mora is also used under the trade name of NATO to make guitars. It is a very hard wood, so it is very good and has a rich color, so it's good for making the casing or the woods of guitars. This is a Mora seed on the forest floor, which is just newly germinated. This seed is fairly large. It's about the size of my fist, so that would be about 10 centimeters long and about 5 centimeters across, so 10 centimeters long and about 5 centimeters across. It would weigh about 500 to 800 grams, and that is a big seed. If that fell from the canopy and hit you on the head, you'd probably, well, knocked unconscious at least. They are very big seeds, so that means they will put up very big seedlings. This is a picture of a Mora seedling, and because the Mora trees, the adult Mora trees create a very low light environment, a very shaded entire canopy with very few sunflecks, Mora seedlings need to be big if they are going to survive. And these large seeds enable Mora seedlings to be, upon germination, on the finish, when all of the resources in this large seeds are used up, this seedling will be about 75 centimeters to a meter tall, and it will have several leaves, about 4 or 5 of these compound leaves, with a very large leaf surface area, which means it will be able to survive in those shaded canopies much better than a smaller seedling. Also, because they're so tall, they'll be able to scavenge any light before any smaller seedlings can. So Mora trees, seedlings, are very well adapted to morphologically to survive in this very low light sub-canopy. Now, it's not just morphological adaptations, dogs. It's not just morphological adaptations which allow a plant to survive in the sub-canopy. There's also physiological adaptations. The humid environment is a plus to help overcome the low light environment. Humid environment allows a plant to escape dehydration to a greater extent in the sub-canopy. If the humidity is seldom below 80 to 90% in the understory, the plant can sit there with their stomata open to maximize the leaf internal CO2 concentration and therefore photosynthesis. If the stomata had to close to preserve water within the body of the plant, if the humidity was lower, then the plant would tend to dry out, and it wouldn't be able to maintain a high maximum leaf internal CO2 and therefore a photosynthetic rate. So therefore humidity is very important to maintaining a positive carbon balance. High humidity means that photosynthesis can occur longer in that low light environment, as the stomata will remain open longer and the leaf internal CO2 concentrations will remain higher longer. If you have a low humidity environment, the stomata will have to close, the internal CO2 concentration will fall, and photosynthesis will stop. Okay? High humidity, photosynthesis can occur longer. So these plants will tend to be adapted to high humidity environments, and they won't be able to survive in lower humidity environments. Photosystems and chlorophyll, the pigment which is needed for photosynthesis, is arranged in the leaf within that thin lamina so that they can capture as much light as possible and not shade each other. So photosystems are very easily saturated by low light levels. In other words, they're adapted to pick up the small amounts of light which are there, and they're easily saturated by low light levels. In other words, their maximum photosynthetic rate is relatively low. So in the understory, everything is geared towards utilizing low levels of light, and the plants will not be able to cope with higher levels of light that you would sometimes get. Right, there are also behavioral adaptations of these plants. By behavioral I mean that they can position themselves in the sub-canopy at the seed dispersal stage to maximize their chances of survival. This is less important for large seeded species. Large seeded species, because they have a large seed, that means they will have a large photosynthetic area upon germination. So they don't really care where they're positioned in the sub-canopy, because they will be able to survive regardless. So they're, as I put down here, heedless of higher resource microsites. So they don't need higher resource microsites to survive. They can survive anywhere. The vast majority of seedlings in the rainforest, however, are not large seeded species. Okay, they're actually small to medium seeded species. They carpet the forest floor with seedlings because, and we'll see later, the trade-off. We talked about those trade-offs already, didn't we? If you have large seeds, then you would tend to have fewer seeds. If you have small to medium-sized seeds, you would tend to have much more seedling seeds. So small to medium-sized species will tend to carpet the forest floor with seedlings, none of which are very large. They have small photosynthetic area, so quite often they never reach the carbon compensation point, and they must live off their seed resources. Once those seed resources are gone, their respiration costs overwhelm their photosynthetic capabilities, and basically they will die because they cannot sustain their root and other body functionings. So these small seedlings gamble on the fact that at least some of those plants will fall in areas where there are sunflecks and a high enough density of sunflecks so that they will get enough light to survive on that forest floor, to increase their photosynthetic area so that they can survive during the darker times of the year when the sunflecks aren't around. Okay, so small to medium-sized species will tend to have more seeds, and they will spread across the forest floor in large clumps of seedlings, so that hoping that at least some of those seedlings will fall in an area where there are enough sunflecks to allow them to gain a positive carbon balance, so that they can grow and increase their photosynthetic area, and so get into a positive carbon balance even without sunflecks, and therefore survive. Large seeded species, they don't need to do that. They have enough photosynthetic area already, so they don't really need sunflecks. So these plants in the sub-canopy will grow very slowly. They will be able to harvest the light. They'll never be too far above the carbon compensation point, so the amount of biomass which they can accumulate will tend to be very slow. They will be able to take advantage of sunflecks. The larger their photosynthetic area gets, the more sunflecks they will have access to, because they'll cover more area, and they will be able to take advantage of temporary gaps or small gaps in the canopy when a branch falls off a tree, for instance, and they will be able to grow. The tree seedlings, the ones which can get up into the canopy, will continue to persist and grow in that understory very slowly until they reach higher and higher in the sub-canopy and eventually reach the canopy. As they grow higher, they get more and more light, and they can grow faster until they reach the canopy where they get the full-on light, and they will stop growing, and they will begin to reproduce. The sub-canopy trees, the ones which don't get above the canopy, which remain in the understory, they will grow in the sub-canopy until they reach a certain size where they got enough photosynthetic area that they are able to accumulate enough carbon that they will be able to reproduce, and they will stop growing and they will start reproducing. These sub-canopy trees, they will not be able to reproduce as much as the trees which get up into the canopy, but they will be able to reproduce earlier, and in other words, they can possibly live as long a period of time. They will, however, be in a more marginal existence, in that if the humidity levels in that forest tend to fall consistently below 90 to 80 to 70%, because the canopy is opened up, for instance, they will really suffer, because they need to have their stomata open all the time to get as much light as possible, and if the humidity falls, then they are going to not keep their stomata open, and therefore photosynthetic rate will fall. This will be offset, however, if the canopy is opened up and there is more light in the understory. Okay, so hopefully you got a fairly good idea of some of the strategies for sub-canopy survival and what the sub-canopy is all about. And in the next part of this lecture, I will talk more about gaps in tropical forests and how important they are. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and see you in the next lecture.